The next segment of the investigation involves the standardized field sobriety test. And they're meant to be exactly just that. Standardized, meaning they're supposed to be administered the same way every single time throughout all 50 states and Texas. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration came up with these tests, and they're designed and they've been evaluated to be able to show with some degree of confidence that a person is intoxicated using these 3 tests. And they're stair-step tests. In other words, it's always going to start with the horizontal gaze nystagmus. It will then move to the walk and turn, and finally the one-leg stand. These 3 tests, the horizontal gaze nystagmus, the one-leg stand, and the walk and turn, were developed in the 1970s in California. The entire premise of these tests is that they were designed to be administered exactly the same way every time. So if officers start cutting corners or not completing the tests as designed, then they don't stand for the proposition that there is a high level of certainty that a person is intoxicated. I can assure you that it will be the defense attorney's job to go through and evaluate the video and the officer's administration of that test, because every officer thinks they're doing a good job, and they fill out these forms that almost always indicate, well, I saw every clue on the first test, I saw most of the clues on the second test, and a majority of clues, or 2 out of 4 clues on the last test. So we're going to talk about each one of these tests, how they're designed to be administered, focusing a lot on the administration of the test, not on your performance, because the officer's out there critiquing your performance. So horizontal gaze nystagmus. Let's first start with this concept of nystagmus. Nystagmus is the involuntary jerking of the eyes. The smallest muscles in your body are currently controlling your eyes, and it's keeping it from jerking back and forth. So as alcohol is introduced into the body, or any central nervous system depressant, you will see that first decision-making is affected. Your mind is affected. Then your muscles, starting with the smallest muscle groups all the way to the largest muscle groups, which is why this first test is an early indicator of whether or not a person might be intoxicated. We're talking about the smallest muscles in your body. That involuntary jerking of your eyes that exists in everyone's eyes becomes noticeable once you've introduced a central nervous system depressant into your system. So that's what a police officer is looking for. One of the things they're not telling you is there are dozens of other types of nystagmus caused by a variety of things. Some arguably would never occur out at the scene. So for example, there's something called rotational nystagmus. That's the nystagmus that would occur in your eyes if your body were spinning. Well, of course, that's not happening out in the field, and most people would never be able to see it. There's post-rotational nystagmus, which is after you've been spinning, if you're brought to a stop, your eyes continue to display that nystagmus that's visible to others. But there are some things that could certainly happen out in the field. In fact, there's something called natural nystagmus. There's some segment of the population that nystagmus is actually visible in their eyes when they've had no central nervous system depressant introduced into their system. Similarly, there are things that can cause nystagmus based on factors outside of you. We talked about officers needing to point the subject, the person they're doing the test on, away from traffic. And that's because a person who is following traffic with their eyes can display nystagmus because they're following that stimulus. An officer also has to be careful in how they administer the test so that they're not moving their stimulus to create the nystagmus they believe they see. What's interesting in these tests is that we are very much having to take the officer at their word as to what they saw in most cases. What do I mean by that? The body cams, although we're very thankful for the body cams and our ability to review what officers say they saw, generally don't capture your eyes. A notable exception occurs sometimes in boating while intoxicated cases. One of my favorite cases to take to trial was a boating while intoxicated case where the game warden claimed he saw all 6 clues, or 3 in each eye, of nystagmus, of this horizontal gaze nystagmus, when he administered the test. Well, the game warden had a visor cam. So he had a camera perched right on his visor, and we could see the subject's eyes. It turns out my client never even looked at the stimulus. There's no way this game warden could have seen the clues that he claimed existed. What we can do, though, in every other case where there's a body cam, is watch what the officer is doing. And by watching what the officer is doing, you can see if the test is at least being administered correctly. Occasionally, officers will administer the horizontal gaze nystagmus test on someone who's been injured. Specifically, an officer might administer the HGN test on someone who's in a stretcher. If that occurs, be sure you talk to your attorney about what's called positional alcohol nystagmus. This is actually a type of nystagmus that can appear when you're laying down on a backboard if your head is turned to the side. An officer needs to start with whether or not this person is a good candidate for the test. They should ask things like, have you had a recent head injury? Because head injuries could affect a person to the point where what the officer is seeing may not be horizontal gaze nystagmus. Similarly, an officer should be checking for pupil size. If the subject's pupils are not of equal size, then the test should not be conducted. So if you see an officer who doesn't ask that question or isn't looking into the subject's eyes before the officer begins a test, that is a red flag for you. Those are essentially qualifiers before you even get to the test. An officer is going to use a stimulus. Typically, that's some sort of a pen, sometimes a pen with a light on it. The officer needs to have a clear view of the person's eyes. So it either needs to be a well-lit area, or they're going to use that stimulus that has a light at the end of it, and they're going to ask the person to focus on the stimulus. The first clue that an officer is looking for is what's called lack of smooth pursuit. So for lack of smooth pursuit, the officer needs to take the stimulus from the center of that person's face, 12 to 15 inches away from their face, and they need to take the stimulus out and back, out and back, checking each eye twice. Now, the out and back needs to be 2 seconds out and 2 seconds back. That's a pretty slow pace. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, and it's not stop, stop. It's one fluid motion. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. Now, when an officer gets to the end, the stimulus should be about 45 degrees from the center of the person's face. So 45 degrees out. That's about as far out as the officer should go. The subject should at all times maintain eye contact with the stimulus. So if I'm the subject and you're the officer, if I'm looking at you the whole time and the stimulus is moving out here, I, the subject, am not actually following the stimulus, and the officer would not have been able to see whether or not I had lack of smooth pursuit. So what are you watching for? You're watching for the officer taking the stimulus out to about a 45-degree angle, taking about 2 seconds to get out and about 2 seconds to come back. They're going to do that test for each eye twice. So for this very first step, you're going to see 2 seconds out, 2 seconds back, 2 seconds out, 2 seconds back, and I'm intentionally going faster, 2 seconds out, 2 seconds back, 2 seconds out, 2 seconds back. All of that for lack of smooth pursuit. So you could very easily pull up a stopwatch and write down the timestamps. I do this every time I'm reviewing a video or certainly going to trial. I'm timing the officer because very often what you'll see is this. And the whole thing takes 4 seconds instead of the prescribed amount of time. And that's for lack of smooth pursuit. That's the first clue in the horizontal gaze nystagmus, which has 3 total possible clues. The next step in the horizontal gaze nystagmus test is what's called distinct and sustained nystagmus at maximum deviation. So now what the officer is going to do is they're going to take their stimulus out, they're going to bring it out, and they're going to hold the stimulus at maximum deviation, so kind of at the periphery, a 45-degree angle, and they're going to look for nystagmus that is distinct and sustained. So let's describe what nystagmus looks like. If you imagine a windshield wiper going over a wet windshield, it's a nice, smooth movement. But if the windshield is dry, that windshield wiper jumps. So that's what you can imagine nystagmus looks like. So if you imagine distinct and sustained nystagmus at maximum deviation, you can imagine the windshield wiper at the end of the windshield just hitting the edge. Or you might imagine a marble that looks like your eye hitting the edge and coming back over and over again. That's what the officer is looking for. Now here, the officer is supposed to hold the stimulus out for 4 seconds because the officer has to confirm not only is the officer seeing nystagmus that's at maximum deviation, but it's distinct and sustained. So he has to see that it continues as he holds a stimulus out there. Once again, this test happens for each eye twice. So you now have 4 more passes total, and you can once again absolutely time this because they're required to hold the stimulus at maximum deviation for 4 seconds. Notice there's not a length of time that it is required to take to go from the middle of your face to maximum for this pass. Instead, the calculation is based on how long did they hold the stimulus there at the maximum deviation. So look at what you're evaluating for. How many passes are happening? And is the officer holding the stimulus out there for the correct amount of time? It is very common for me to see officers take a shortcut and not do both eyes twice, or not hold the stimulus out there for 4 seconds. And just because they did it the first time for 4 seconds doesn't mean the second time they get to come back around, look at it for 1 second and say, yeah, that's the same thing I saw. The way the test is designed, they're supposed to go through each one of these steps correctly. The final step in the horizontal gaze nystagmus test is onset of nystagmus prior to 45 degrees. So now the officer is going to take the stimulus out and slowly determine where the officer first begins to see that nystagmus or shaking of the eyes. And what the officer is trying to determine is whether or not that nystagmus begins before the officer has reached the 45-degree angle. Like the totality of these tests, this is a stair-step test. In other words, if you don't see the first clue, that's the lack of smooth pursuit, you should never go on and look for distinct and sustained nystagmus at maximum deviation. And if you don't get that second clue, you should never be looking for onset prior to 45 degrees. Each standardized field sobriety test has a decision point. For the horizontal gaze nystagmus, if you get 2 clues out of the total 6, then that is the decision point to move on to the next test. What you need to be prepared for is if an officer is well prepared and well trained, they're going to testify that of all 3 tests, the horizontal gaze nystagmus is the most accurate, and they rely on it a great deal. So you need to very closely watch how the officer is administering the tests, any shortcuts they took or mistakes that they made, and you're looking for your own response to that. Horizontal gaze nystagmus specifically can only be caused by certain types of things. They're sometimes referred to as DID, D-I-D, depressants, specifically central nervous system depressants, inhalants, and dissociative anesthetics. But remember, there are many other types of nystagmus. So if you have natural nystagmus, or the officer has you facing the flow of traffic, or there are other reasons why nystagmus might be present, that's something you and your attorney need to talk about. You need to evaluate whether or not the officer administered that test correctly. And that begins with looking at, did they conduct a preliminary screening to see if this was a good candidate to take the test? Did they use the right number of passes, the right length of time for each pass? Did they hold the stimulus out for the right duration? These are all things you need to look at and evaluate in determining whether or not the horizontal gaze nystagmus test was administered properly. In the thousands of driving while intoxicated cases I've reviewed, I would say about 80 to 90% of those cases had a score of 6 out of 6 clues for horizontal gaze nystagmus. And that small percentage of cases that didn't have all 6 marked off 4 clues out of 6. Because remember, the officer only needs 2 clues to move on to the next test. But it's so common for officers to say they saw 4 or usually all 6 of those clues. As important as the horizontal gaze nystagmus test is for the officer, it is also the one that is most often administered incorrectly and most often missed by defense attorneys who are reviewing the case, because no one really likes taking the time and effort to look at a DWI video that closely, count the number of passes, time the duration to figure out if the officer administered the test correctly. But it is critical. It's the foundation upon which all the next tests occur. So if you have a good argument that the horizontal gaze nystagmus was not administered correctly, you should also argue that but for that test, the officer would not have gone on to the walk-in turn and one-leg stand. You need to make the most of any mistakes in the horizontal gaze nystagmus test, and I can assure you, most officers do not do this test correctly, either because they've been trained poorly, it's been a long time since they went through training or a refresher course, it's the end of their shift, they don't want to put in the work because they know most people won't challenge it. It is the best way in many cases to fight your DWI case is to really drill down on the horizontal gaze nystagmus test. The horizontal gaze nystagmus test is often followed up by vertical gaze nystagmus. That's when the officer takes a stimulus and raises it above your head. Now, if the officer sees vertical gaze nystagmus, so nystagmus when the stimulus is above your head, that is supposed to indicate a high level of intoxication for that person. The for that person part is important because if you're someone who doesn't drink regularly, you might display vertical gaze nystagmus at even an objectively low blood alcohol concentration. On the other hand, for someone who drinks regularly, and if they admit that, the officer is going to say not only was this person intoxicated, this was a high level of intoxication for this person. The next test in the standardized field sobriety test battery is the walk and turn. The walk and turn test looks for 8 clues. And if you have 2 out of the 8 clues, the officer is going to say that is a decision point to go on to the next test. In other words, they believe you're intoxicated. Now, what's interesting about the walk and turn test is they never tell you what the clues are that they're looking for. Instead, they'll give you the instructions. So when an officer asks you to begin the test, they're going to ask you to put one foot on the line and put your other foot in front of the first foot and have your arms down by your side. Now, this is not a natural position for people to stand in, yet the officer is giving you instructions for the remainder of the test during this time. If you do what many people do, because this is not a natural position to stand in, and break that starting position, maybe you stand with your legs kind of shoulder width in a better position to keep your stability at any time, the officer is actually going to write down that you failed to maintain your starting position, which is the first clue of intoxication that they're looking for. The second clue is if you start too soon. So the officer is giving you instructions that take about a minute to go through. So if you hear the officer say something along the lines of, I'm going to ask you to take a series of 9 heel-to-toe steps. You hear that instruction and you begin to take the 9 heel-to-toe steps. The officer is going to mark the second clue of intoxication, that you started the test too soon. Of a total of 8 possible clues, the officer only needs 2 to reach the decision point that you're intoxicated. Another example of a clue that an officer commonly puts down is the person did not turn as prescribed. So the officer is going to tell you when you get to that 9th step, you're going to keep your lead foot planted. You're going to turn using a series of small steps. So if you get to the 9th step and you turn around the way most people would turn around without keeping your lead foot planted and taking small steps around your lead foot, that's going to be counted as a sign of intoxication. So very easily, you can have 2 or 3 clues of intoxication that may not stem from intoxication. It's that you've heard a series of instructions probably for the first time in your life, and you didn't even remember all of them. Most people think if you walk 9 heel-to-toe steps on a relatively straight line, you've passed the test, and the officer is not telling you what the clues of intoxication are. This is why many people say it is a relatively unfair test. The officer's asking you to do these things, he's grading your paper without ever telling you what you're being graded on. And the threshold for the officer to say, I've reached a decision point that you're intoxicated, I need to move on to the next test, is very low. We talked about the first 2 clues that actually begin before you've even started to walk. The other 6 clues, building off one we've already mentioned, which is the improper turn, are stops while walking, steps off of the line, takes the wrong number of steps, misses heel to toe. And here, missing heel to toe means your feet were more than half an inch apart. Using arms for balance. Here, using your arms for balance means your arms came away from your body by more than 6 inches, including turning improperly and the first 2 clues that we mentioned. That's a total of 8 clues that the officer is looking for. An officer who is properly trained is going to testify at a trial that just based on the walk and turn test, if they get 2 out of the 8 possible clues, they've been trained that 68% of the time, not only is the person intoxicated, they're at a 0.10 blood alcohol concentration or better. Remember, of the 3 standardized field sobriety tests, officers rely the most on HGN, but a properly trained and educated officer is going to put a lot of weight on a walk and turn test, even when the score is only 2 out of 8 possible clues. As you you're reviewing your video for the walk and turn, you need to point out the things that just don't make sense. First of all, any errors in how the officer administered the test needs to be pointed out. It is a somewhat lengthy set of instructions that the officer is giving you. If the officer makes even the slightest mistake in administering that test, you need to make sure your attorney points out this officer went through 24 to 40 hours of training just to become a peace officer specifically related to driving while intoxicated investigations. They've heard the instructions dozens of times. They've given the instruction hundreds of times. And if that officer forgets even one step in the instructions, how are you at midnight or 2 a.m., a person who has heard these instructions for the first time in your life, expected to remember every little thing you're supposed to do, especially when you're not told what you're being graded on? You're not told that if your arms come away from your body by more than 6 inches, that counts as a clue. You're not told that if your feet are not less than half an inch apart when you walk heel to toe, that is a clue of intoxication. In front of a jury who's not going to be as callous as a prosecutor, the point has to be made that you are hearing these instructions for the first time, and frankly, you look good on video. That argument may not get very far with the prosecutor, but it will get far with a jury of 6 people in a misdemeanor or 12 people in a felony, because normal people understand this is not a normal test. This isn't how you stand. This isn't how you walk normally. There's a big distinction between being able to do a test like that on a good day versus should someone have taken your keys because you were too drunk to drive. Now notice the distinction that we're making in this argument. The law doesn't say anything about drunk driving. In fact, when you look at the driving while intoxicated statute, it never uses the word driving. It only talks about operating a motor vehicle. And it never uses the word drunk. But when you're talking to a jury, that's what your attorney needs to be talking about, is not the standard the state wants to keep talking about and their definition of intoxication, not because the law is wrong, but because it's an amorphous definition. The definition uses a term like normal. Well, what my normal is and what your normal is, it's not going to be the same. And as we talked about, your normal from 8 in the morning to 2 in the morning, it's not going to be the same. And your attorney needs to talk to people the way that they understand, in a way that resonates with them. So if your test is, I have 2 or 3 clues, and the officer saying, hey, that to me is intoxication, your attorney needs to focus on, well, what you're trying to determine is whether or not this person was normal, mentally or physically. Do you know what this person's normal is on any given day? No. Do you know if the person understood your instructions? Did you offer to repeat your instructions to them? How many times have you heard these instructions? And again, if the officer made mistakes, the time is now to point those mistakes out. The final test in the battery of standardized field sobriety tests is the one-leg stand. The one-leg stand has 4 possible clues that the officer is looking for. The 4 clues that an officer is looking for are the individual sways while balancing, they use their arms to balance, they hop, or they put their foot down. In fact, if you put your foot down 2 times or more, that's an automatic failure of the test. For this test, which has 4 possible clues and has you keeping 1 foot off the ground for approximately 30 seconds, if you show even 2 clues, the officer is going to say that was a sign of intoxication for me. The officer's arrest decision then at a probable cause level is going to be based on what they call a totality of the circumstances. Everything from when your vehicle was in motion, the personal contact, the roadside investigation, which includes the field sobriety tests, are all going to be part of the officer's narrative to get to probable cause. Probable cause is still low level of proof. Now, it's higher than reasonable suspicion that was required to stop you, but probable cause simply means articulable facts that an offense has occurred. So what's the officer going to point to? How you drove, what you did when you were in the vehicle, when you got out of the vehicle, admissions you made, odors, things that the officer observed, as well as how you did on the standardized field sobriety test. Now, by not doing the standardized field sobriety test, you're taking away some of the most critical pieces of the officer's investigation, which means the officer has to make a decision to either arrest you based on the limited information they have, or risk having the case thrown out because a reviewing judge does not agree that probable cause existed to place you under arrest.